Hello, and welcome to the Psychology Podcast with Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, where we give you insights into the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity. Each episode will feature a new guest who will stimulate your mind and give you a greater understanding of yourself, others, and the world we live in. Hopefully, we'll also provide a glimpse into human possibility. Thanks for listening and enjoy the podcast. Today, it's really great to have Stephen Hayes on the podcast. Stephen is the father of acceptance and commitment therapy and is currently a Nevada Foundation professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Nevada. He's an author of over 45 books, including his bestseller Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life, and he has published more than 600 scientific articles. Stephen's interests cover basic research, applied research, methodology, and philosophy of science. He maintains an active laboratory focused on language pragmatics and semantic relations. His recent applied research has been focused on the analysis of emotional acceptance methods in psychotherapy, where he currently has a $1 million grant to apply his methods in online therapy. I'm really excited to have Stephen on the podcast today, and hope that you can join in the discussion by going to thepsychologypodcast.com. Thanks so much for being on the podcast, Stephen.
I'm glad to be here with you.
Oh boy, lots we could talk about. You do a lot of really, truly life-changing research. So first of all, thank you for doing such life-changing research.
I'm flattered by it, but we have tried to go out to the kind of the edges of where the field may be and push a little bit on the inside of the bubble without popping out into our own. So yeah,
that's always good.
It puts us into issues that have broad implications.
For sure. So this idea of acceptance and commitment therapy, I was wondering how it has changed over the years. In more recent years, have updated the model much?
Well, it's evolved. I think you're seeing more in the way of social scaling, of trying to think about how psychological flexibility applies to couples and families and institutions in the culture. It's become more closely linked to evolution science, and so we've combined it with Elinor Ostrom's design principles for protecting common pool resources, and we've extended that out into pro-social groups around the world doing these kind of evolution science combinations in Africa and things like that. I think the mindfulness traditions hit, kind of after ACT came out, and although it's been viewed as part of the kind of wave of interest in mindfulness that's happened in Western culture, some of the technology, I think it depends on the protocol, wasn't necessarily there, and so you're seeing more combinations. I think the biggest single thing, if you go now versus, let's say, where we first kind of present it to the world, because ACT was developed in the early 80s, but it wasn't presented to the world till right around the turn of the century, because we were working on the underlying basic principle and theory of language and cognition and things like that. I think the single biggest change from, let's say, 1999 to now is that it's much less focused on a protocol and more focused on these change processes that are involved in psychological flexibility, how to see them, target them, change them. And I think we're learning that ACT is not the only method that does that it's a really important change process in many different forms of therapy, but that ACT does a pretty good job of moving them. So it's been, I think, a progressive part of the evidence-based care, but is now maturing and linking out to a more process-focused approach, not just to psychotherapy, but to behavior change and everything from stepping up to the challenge of the Ebola crisis to how to run your business and organization.
That all sounds really good. People refer to acceptance and commitment therapy as the third wave of cognitive behavioral therapies. Now, did you personally call it the third wave? And what are the first and second waves?
Yeah, I did. I used that term in 2004. It was an article linked to my presidential address at the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapy. And what I saw was that it wasn't just the behavioral folks, it was the cognitive folks across the line. People were beginning to question the underlying assumptions that had settled in cognitive behavior therapy for about 25, 30 years. So the first wave, I would say, is the behavior therapy, behavior analysis, behavior modification wave, where laboratory-based principles, mostly in the learning lab, were scaled up into evidence-based interventions for people. So it really was the first strong evidence-based therapy wave was the behavior therapy, I think you'd have to say. But, I'm old enough to remember when that wave happened, but also when it shifted to cognitive behavior therapy, when people realized, you had to deal with language and cognition. You couldn't just let it sit there and use principles that were only developed in the animal lab. And so there was a shift to a cognitive model combined with those that we got from that era of behavioral principles being scaled into behavior change, with people like Ellis and Mahoney and Beck and Meichenbaum and so forth. And the core assumption there was that, the important focus are the nature of human cognition and the errors that we make and how we think about things. And that if we can get that cleaned up, then our emotions will fit more of the situation. We'd better be able to behave to fit the situation. But unlike the first wave, the second wave wasn't built on laboratory principles of cognition. It was more built on clinical models, because we really didn't have an adequate, pragmatically oriented theory of language and cognition that we could scale into the clinic. And then across the board, there were not just the behavioral people, but the cognitive people began to challenge that in the mid-90s. And so by 2004, I could see it coming, and I basically said, what's happening is that we're shifting our underlying assumptions. We're beginning to look at a relationship to emotion and thought, not just the content of thought. And the underlying model, because of that, is changing, bringing in, some of the deeper parts of the clinical traditions, things in emotion and experiencing, things like that are popular, let's say, in humanistic, existential, analytic approaches, but also bringing in things out of Eastern thought and mindfulness traditions. And so acceptance, mindfulness, values, etc., were coming in as well. And it raised a lot of woo-ha. People ran around in circles and said, no, that's not happening. What are you talking about? But, within a few years, Tim Beck is up there talking to the Dalai Lama. I mean, it just happened. And whether you wanted it to happen or not, it just happened. And the wave washed in. I think people were afraid that what I meant was the wave was going to wash away what was there before. But actually what I said in that article is, no, it's going to build. You stand on the shoulder to giants. But when things change like that, that everybody starts thinking about things differently. And that's happened. So traditional CBT no longer really is traditional CBT. Even behavior analysis, behavior modification isn't the same anymore. And we are definitely into an era now where that family or that tradition is in a really good position to talk to other parts of the clinical wings and beyond that, of people who are more humanistic, dynamic, existential, and so forth, in a way that's very respectful, and to bring in what has happened in the area of mindfulness and some of those methods, but yet do so in a new way, not just another wave of spiritual religious interest or something like that, or, not the Maharishi and the Beatles, but something more like, let's really dig in and see what's inside these other traditions, turn them into principles that make sense, and then put them into human lives through evidence-based procedures. And that's, really happening right now in front of us, in part because of changes in the federal funding apparatus, but for other reasons. Evidence-based therapy is moving from protocols for syndromes to an era of processes linked to human needs. And I think that's a huge step forward that the third wave helped happen.
I completely agree. And I'm a big fan of the humanistic and existential psychotherapy perspectives and their focus on needs. It's wonderful. Okay, you know what? Let's back up a second. Can you define ACT?
So I think the best definition of ACT is just to think of it as a set of methods that are focused on a model called psychological flexibility, which basically says that human problems are exacerbated and human prosperity is limited by a collection of related processes. They kind of hang out together. There's 6 of them that we focused on. They're like 6 sides of a box. So there's 6 aspects of one thing. And that is that we get entangled with judgmental, kind of linear, categorical, evaluative thought. Out of that, we begin to avoid our own emotions, sensations, and so forth. We turn our inner life into a problem to be solved. We then lose the attentional flexibility that we need to the world within, and we start focusing only on the things that are relevant to that problem agenda we gave ourselves. And we climb inside the clown suit of whatever our judgmental mind tells us about who we are and who others are, this more ego-based story of I'm a person who, and other people are like this, missing the shared consciousness that brings us together with other human beings. And out of all that, we put on hold the deepest yearning for meaning and purpose that we have, focusing instead on trying to win the war within and figuring eventually we'll get out there to living and loving and contributing and playing. And then we don't build habits of action that are organized around our values, but we build habits of our action that are built around our patterns of avoidance and self-aggrandizement. Those 6 things, which if you want
to get into them, we'll get into them later.
Yeah, those are what we call psychological inflexibility. And if we can flip them, and in each case there's a flip, there's a pivot, there's a turn, you can take the energy that's inside those things and just turn it like you would turn the corner, like you would swing a partner around when you're dancing. And you take the energy that's inside that, which is not so bad, it's just that it's being put in the wrong direction, and spin it towards a direction that leads to greater flexibility and presence and connection with the deepest issues of meaning and purpose, and building habits around that. It turns out that psychological flexibility is probably the single most, I'm sorry for the self-praise, but the single most powerful single set of processes in terms of predicting psychopathology over time, in terms of mediating treatment, and not just ACT, but some other important methods. And it turns out that we've been targeting it all along. We just didn't know that. And I think the reason that it's like that is it's just a reflection of evolutionary thinking. How do you create variation that fits the context, that can be selected and retained? And that's how evolution works. And with a few other bells and whistles about the dimensions you pick and the levels that are evolving. But so I don't think it's a model that's going to disappear tomorrow. You could relabel it. You could give it different names. And in fact, there's lots of people who do. Metacognitive therapy has concepts that line up. Values aren't in there. There's a few things that aren't. Dialectical behavior therapy, motivational interviewing, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. There's a whole fruit nut seed mix of acronyms for what is spinning around a common set of processes of flexibility, selection, and retention processes. So
then why do we need all these different brands?
We don't.
I mean, it kind of drives me crazy sometimes. Like, if everyone's talking about the same underlying truth, isn't it the truth that matters, not the brand?
You betcha. And, one of the, there's something like 15 different names for ACT out there. And we have people who've been even presidents of our society, the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. You notice that our name for our society doesn't have the word ACT in it.
Yeah.
Like one of the presidents does work called mindfulness-based emotional intelligence training. What is that? Well, that's ACT. So it doesn't matter, and I think long run, we're headed into a new era. And I'm working closely with my colleagues, including some who are active critics of ACT, like Stefan Hoffman. He and I have finished a couple of books. And what we're basically doing is saying, look, this era of name brand protocols that fit into these cubbyholes of suffering called syndromes is passing away. And what will be left behind are evidence-based processes linked to evidence-based procedures. It turns out ACT will be fine in that, whether you call it ACT or not, because all ACT ever thought it was, to go back to your first question, is a model for how you organize certain key change processes. And whether you call it this or that doesn't matter as long as we know what the domain is we're talking about. And so I agree. It's time to bury the acronym list.
Yeah, I guess, from an existential psychotherapy point of view, all of us want to feel like we truly existed in this world. And I think people there's a fundamental human need to brand an idea you have to make yourself feel as though this is a really deep philosophical point I'm making.
Exactly with you. I mean, you don't have to sniff very hard before you realize people are grasping at immortality.
That's what's going on here.
That's what they're doing, is that they don't want to face their own death. When I'm talking about this in workshops and stuff, I say, okay, everybody who can name all of your great-greats, 1/8 of your body, isn't just your father and mother, or your grandfather and grandmother, but the generation before that. I want all 8, including their maiden names, stand up if you can name them. Well, in a group of 200 people, one person will stand up. And so I say, look, okay, now think about this. This means that your children's children's children won't even freaking know your name. So if you are trying to play for immortality, grow up. Grow up. I mean, but there is something that's important, which is, can we put something into the culture that will be there for your children's children's children, even though they didn't know you had anything to do with it? most people will sign on to that. They'll say, yeah. So the game the contextual behavioral science community is playing is not about ACT. We actually actively bring in this whole fruit nut seed mix of acronyms that you named and others, including traditional CBT folks. We bring in the humanistic folks and existential folks and analytic folks. And Susan David will be giving a talk to 2018 at her major conference, etc.
I do love her. Yeah. So
Yeah,
she's
great.
been on this podcast. Yeah.
Well, she invited me out to the Harvard, the Coaching Institute, and I had a blast out there. And she's very smart, very able, and I love that book, and I recommend it. So what we need to do is get, what does science show are the key processes? And by the way, people who weren't necessarily part of our tradition have for a long time been talking about things that are pretty important.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, like, when I read some of your writings, I see a lot of it in Kabat-Zinn's writings as well. So, who, of course, adapted from Eastern philosophy and,
Sure, so you'll see those Eastern things, but, I'll broaden that out even more, Scott. I mean, right now there's something like 40 randomized trials on ACT done in Iran.
Wow.
40 randomized trials. Why? Because there's an Islamic tradition of psychotherapy that happened 500 years ago that is spooky in terms of how much it lines up with ACT. And I get the emails saying, okay, this is just Buddhism, isn't it? But I now get emails saying, okay, admit it, you read the Quran and you kind of ripped it off. Well, I am reading the Quran because I think everybody should. If you're you need to understand what's going on in the world and why are these struggles going on between certain wings of Islamic thinking and so forth. And I had a person from Iran who was also a U.S. citizen who was able to do this despite the restrictions come and join my lab for a year last year as a postdoc. But, look, inside the wisdom traditions of every single major religion, every single one, there are ways of reining in analytic, judgmental language. Whether it's the Sufis or the Kabbalists or the mystics, etc. And the wisdom traditions impact on our deeper clinical traditions. And now what Western science can bring is a particular analytic way, if it's respectful, of taking those things and really digging into what are the underlying processes. And not just to rename it or to, claim it as our own, but to really pull it at its joints. And, John Kabat-Zinn has done that by sort of demystifying Vipassana. Herb Benson did it by demystifying TM and that tradition of meditation. I think the ACT folks are taking it down even another level because we are the only one, of which I'm aware, that has a very active laboratory-based science of language and cognition in the basement with several hundred articles on what is language and cognition, how does it work, that is directly linked to this developmental tradition. So we're trying to sort of, take it to another level of taking these deepest issues of meaning and purpose and what it means to be human, but then actually trying to get what is going on here inside Homo sapiens such that we're doing what you and I are doing right now. And it's way different than what was going on just 100 years ago. But I can look out my side of the window and see a bird, and what it's doing is not that different from what it was doing 1,000 years ago. Something's going on here, and we need to understand it. And that's really the game that the ACT folks are playing that does bring something new to the table. It isn't that, if part of what you're saying was like, oh, there's wisdom in all these places, and yeah, there is. But how do we create something that's progressive? How do we create something that adds to what's there? And to me, it's not just doing randomized clinical trials on things that the monks were doing.
Agreed.
To me, I really want to know at a very basic level, what are these processes? And therefore, how can we move them even faster? And that will be new, but it shouldn't be pridefully new like we invented it, because almost everything we're looking at has been talked about, for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Yeah, really great points. And regarding your work, you have done a lot of work on language and cognition. You said there's a piece coming out soon that is on the topic. Is that right?
There is actually in the June 3rd issue of New Scientist. Relational frame theory and ACT were developed in the early 80s at the same time. ACT out of me dealing with my own panic disorder, finding that I really only got traction when I turned back to Hippie Hill and to the human potential movement and the places that my CBT and behavioral training didn't tell me I should turn to. and then being fascinated with that. How is that true? That these traditions, which you wouldn't think of necessarily as scientific traditions or evidence-based, gave me more traction. And I, became convinced that an agenda I'd had since being a graduate student, that we really need to understand language and cognition, should be my central focus. So relational frame theory emerged in the early 80s, or right about the time that we formulated acceptance and commitment therapy, although its early name was called comprehensive distancing. And it doesn't get released to the world until 1999. But in the period from the earliest trials in the early 80s to then, we worked out this alternative approach. It's kind of been in the basement and geeky, and people don't really understand it. And does this really have anything to do with ACT anyway? But just within the last 7 years, it puttered along. The first book came out in 2001. It puttered along, with a couple or 3 articles a year. But in the last 7 years, there's been 160 articles, experimental articles on RFT. And really, for the first time, just like ACT sort of broke on the scene in 2006 when Time did a 5-page story on me and on ACT, this article is kind of an example of what's starting to happen with RFT. We have the ability to do some very cool things. We can raise kids' IQ by 10, 11, 12 points in about 6 months. We can do implicit cognition measures better than anything that exists on the planet. We can establish a sense of self in kids that don't have it. We can do language training in ways that are significant steps forward from what was there before with disabled children. And we can understand what's going on between you and I right now and what's going on in psychotherapy now that we've created what I think is the first really practical, pragmatic theory of language and cognition that's robust in the lab and easily touches the clinic. I'm sorry if it sounds prideful and self-praising. I don't like that kind of thing. But you could shoot me tomorrow and I don't care that much about where ACT goes. But RFT, I would predict, is going to hang around for a while because we haven't really had an approach to language and cognition that really did the job that applied folks want. And, I think we've made a step forward with RFT. So it's really cool to have it coming out.
That's awesome. There's nothing wrong with authentic pride, by the way, as long as it's not hubristic pride. There's nothing wrong with authentic.
It is authentic pride. It's just after a 30-plus year run, it's nice to see it finally catching on and making sense.
Well, this work on cognition and language, I want to circle back to the mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral theory because you hinted earlier that that's just a reframing of ACT. So what I'm trying to understand is, where are the idea of thought distortions? What role does that play in your relational frame theory?
Okay, and let me be careful to say, I'm not saying that MBCT, et cetera, is a reframing of ACT, not at all. I'm just saying we're fellow travelers.
Okay. And
we're working kind of in the same area. I do think Susan David's reframing in terms of emotional flexibility is very directly linked to ACT concepts, and she says so in her book, but that's not to minimize what she's done. It's brilliant and well done. No, MBCT is trying to bring Vipassana into the clinic and do it in a way that really can be transportable, and it was wonderfully done. It's had a huge impact on the thinking of evidence-based therapists around the world. But coming back to the bigger question you asked, let me ask this question. What is really going on inside, something like meditation? If you take a Vipassana style, follow the breath meditation, that needs to be understood at the level of basic processes, not just looking at the underlying neurobiology. That's fine. But I want to know psychologically, what are people doing? Procedurally, we know. In terms of the underlying neurobiology, we're learning a lot. Well, what RFT says, the 30-second version of it is language is not associative. It's relational. And it's new on the planet with Homo sapiens, or maybe some of the early hominids, but it's not what your dog does. It's not what your cat does. It is what your 12-month infant is doing. And once you understand that that's the unit, you can push it, modify it, change it, facilitate it. And I can give you one example of a place where that unit would really hit the ground in the area of meditation, but it'd take about 2 minutes. You want to hear it?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, how about this thing? There's a sense of self that emerges that's transcendent, the kind of observer you. One of the early book, Deichmann, called The Observing Self or something, from years ago, talked about meditation with this cast, that there's a sense of the observer emerging. Well, in the lab, this idea that it's relational, not associative. Associations tend not to be bidirectional, and they're bound by time and space. We put things together because they look similar or they happen together, and it tends to be in unidirectional, a little bit bidirectional, but not much. Like bell food, bell food, bell food. The bell, you begin to salivate before the food. But when I give a dish of Alpo to my dog, it doesn't run to the door to answer the doorbell. That just doesn't happen because they learned it in one direction, not two. That's not the way human beings work. If you learn it in one direction, you'll derive it in two. If you know that round red thing's called an apple, and I say to a 12-month-old infant, where's the apple? It'll move its wobbly head around to try to find the apple. Learn it in one direction, derive it in two. That's a relational phenomenon. And it comes, I believe, out of social relationships. And so this sense of witnessing is something that your mama saw in your eyes when your mama said, "You sweet baby," and was looking for not just that you're awake and your eyes are open, but that she could see, that you could see her seeing you. If you actually go back and you say, how do people get brought in for autistic spectrum disorder problems? It's because mother brought them in and they're saying to the pediatrician, my baby sees me but doesn't really see me. Mama sees that there's not this interactive consciousness there. Well, it turns out that's built out. That's the core of human language, and it then builds out. It's bidirectional. It isn't just one directional. I and you are in a relationship, and this starts echoing into some more deeper clinical traditions. And it then gets built out into language. And so there's a coming together in consciousness of I, you, of here, there, and of now, then. We can measure it, we can target it, we can change it, and we can take kids who don't have that sense of self, that person behind their eyes, and establish it, at least facilitate it, by targeting these processes. I know that's only a thumbnail version, but the geek science of it is a little hard to say out loud. But suffice it to say that I think we can measure the underlying cognitive processes that are giving rise to this transcendent sense of self that is fostered in meditation and is critical to being able to be more open and more flexible with your own emotions, your own thoughts, your memories, your past pains, and being able to allocate attention towards what brings meaning and purpose in your life, which is basically what the mindfulness traditions are all about. So I want to figure it out at that level, all the way down to what that baby was doing and what mama did in language training about bringing that baby into human consciousness.
You're such a nerd.
I am a complete nerd.
Well, you really fit in here at the Psychology Podcast, just so you know. So, I want to just define psychological flexibility. I'm not going to define it. I'm going to read how you've defined it.
Sure.
The ability to contact the present moment more fully as a conscious human being and to change your persistent behavior when doing so serves valued ends. Do you still agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So I thought it would be beneficial to actually define that term. And, another aspect from Buddhism that you build off of is the idea that human suffering is universal. And your work on language also shows how language leads directly to suffering. Is that right?
Yeah, true. Although I'd probably say human pain is universal. Suffering is something we kind of add to it because of our mishandling of pain, driven by this problem-solving mode of mind that has been so put on steroids by the modern culture that we've created a huge problem for ourselves by how we use our cognitive capacity. But yeah, basically, I would agree with that.
Well, I'm just repeating back what you've said. But yeah, you say, well, so then what is the problem with pain?
There isn't a problem with pain other than a needless pain, of course, should be dealt with. I have no interest in putting our hands on the hot stove. But some forms of pain come with living. Knowing that you're going to die is painful. Knowing that your children are going to die is painful. And it's part of living. It's part of life itself. Suffering actually comes from a etymology that has this idea of carrying a burden, and it has from up and under you're carrying, like the ferry part is like a ferry boat, and the suff part of suffering is up and under. It has that metaphor of like getting up under something really heavy and carrying it. Well, why don't you just put it down? Just put it.
Oh, yeah.
You don't have to carry it. You do not have to carry it. Pain, yes. Pain that's willingly experienced is not the same pain. For one thing, pain contains things that you care about. If you've lost something and you're just grieving over it, what's inside that is the love that you had for what you lost. That's not your enemy. I mean, for goodness sakes, in the modern world, 2 weeks or more of grief, and it's enough to crank the person up.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Think about it, that we've got a culture that's so hostile to emotions that these basic biological functions of walking through grief in order to come out the other side with the energy to learn new things, which is what happens when, with this sense of withdrawal and stepping back and almost this sensory deprivation, and then you explode out into new relationships and new exploring. Even non-human animals do that. But no, we don't. We want to run from pain at all costs. And the cost is huge because it's kind of the cost of our own vitality. Our capacity to experience pain of loss is directly linked, it isn't just the poets who say this, to our capacity to experience joy and connection. When we first measured experiential avoidance and psychological inflexibility, I used to say experiential avoidance was avoiding difficult, aversive, negative emotions, thoughts, and feelings. That's not true. It's not true. We now know it. There's an example of something that's changed, because what it turned out was the case is that if you did that chronically, you started avoiding positive emotions too, because the bigger you are, the harder you fall. If you're happy now, you might be sad tomorrow. And we all know this. Like if you've been rejected in love and you really start getting in this defensive place where, I'll never be so vulnerable again, meaning the word means to not be woundable. Yeah, but if somebody's close to you, they could wound you. If they die suddenly, that's going to wound you. So closeness and wounding is one thing. It's not two things. It's one thing. So what your mind does is it says, I'll solve the problem of pain by solving the problem of vitality. Well, vitality is not a problem. Vitality, enjoyment, recreation, play, love. So, the same space, this anti-life space that says, I can't hurt, is the one that says, I can't laugh, I can't love, I can't dance, I can't sing, I can't play. I mean, it'll get you down to a nubbin where you can't do anything except wait for life to be over. So we actually see this. Todd Kashdan, who you should have on your program, wonderful.
I did. I've had him on.
Awesome. Okay, well, Todd's wonderful. You know what energy he brings to his work.
Oh, he's great.
He's kind of part of our larger community. But he has this cool study where he's followed highly experiencedly avoidant, socially anxious people doing experience sampling. And wonderful things happen. People get complimented. They get invited to social events. Good things happen. What happens? Their joy goes up, and then boom, it plummets, like way faster than normal. Why? They dare not laugh. They dare not smile. They dare not feel connected and loved and cared for. I mean, it's just enough to make you almost want to cry at the human condition, that inside our running from pain, we have to run from life itself. So pain is unavoidable. Suffering, let's learn how to put that down, put that burden down, and have just the good, clean pain of living and loving and losing and dying.
That's beautiful. You've a little poet in you as well as nerd. You're a nerdy poet.
Nerdy poet.
I'm just thinking if this relates at all. My dissertation was on openness to experience, and that's the topic I've studied for the past 15 years. That's been the main construct that I've been studying in my own work. And I think there needs to be better linkages between that work and the work you're doing, the flip side of experiential avoidance, because I found a factor in openness to experience that had been neglected, that I argued in my dissertation had been neglected in the openness to experience domain, and I called it affective openness, affective openness. And really what it was is I was drawing a lot on Seymour Epstein's experiential cognitive model, and he has experiential mind and then the rational mind. So he really influenced me a lot, and we were in discussion with each other a lot when I was working on my dissertation. And I adapted some of his tests of experiential thinking preference style versus rational preference thinking. And I found that, in factor analyzing the experiential thinking styles with the other openness to experience, it fit within the openness to experience domain of personality and affective openness I defined as being fully open to both your positive and negative emotions. But I found that correlated with so many variables like creativity, this preconscious latent inhibition type thinking, of compassion. It actually was really strongly correlated with compassion.
Sure. Well, we
So,
found
yeah.
that in our work too. And when I've said let's not struggle about the names, but come to we're fellow travelers.
Oh,
I mean, what you're
definitely.
saying is right inside the act work. And
That's why I
I'm
bring it up, by the
absolutely,
way.
yeah, of course, absolutely fine with that. We can have different names and different traditions. It doesn't have to be agreeing on the names, but we can agree on the core of it and then play it out and stay in conversation with each other. And we found the same thing. I mean, I've seen that link to compassion. We've seen, this kind of emotional openness, which is the flip side of experiential avoidance. And in the act work, there's a lot of kind of emotional exploration of deliberately spend taking the time to feel and of creating contexts in which you can learn about your own feelings, thoughts, memories, bodily sensations, and so forth without grabbing on them and turning them into a problem to be solved just because your mind judges them. And so, yeah, we're learning to hold the mind, the judgmental part of the mind at bay, coming into the present moment, being able to broaden out your focus, see what's there inside and out. That's the sense in which I was saying, I think we're agreeing on a common core set of processes. And one reason I'm trying to move the field towards process-based therapy is that then we can put down our differences of school and language and technique and then focus instead on what are the underlying change processes that liberate human beings. And
That makes a lot of sense.
openness to experience. It will do the lion's share of the work around psychological flexibility. If you just had, I bet you I could take your measure and it will correlate heavily with ours and it'll do the lion's share of the work. Now, there's a few things that are not in that, like the values piece.
Right.
It steps up the values piece because, for example, you can't really value something like, let's say, being a loving person if love is threatening because you're going to feel vulnerable. So the emotional openness to experience thing is a platform on which attentional flexibility or values-based work then gets placed. Because as long as that's not solid, you can't afford to know what you care about because you hurt where you care. And if hurting is something you can't do, then you better not care.
Oh, it's. I mean, these are really profound point. Yeah, absolutely. Like, I don't know. Like, I really would like to get into the six. I'd really love to dive a little bit deeper into the six processes. Could you go
Okay.
through each one step one by one?
Yeah, maybe I should do it in a positive way since I just did it in a negative way.
That'd be great.
One nice thing about the model is that the model of psychopathology or of restriction of behavioral growth and prosperity flipped over is the model of treatment and of behavior change. So, the flexibility processes are this cognitive flexibility we call cognitive diffusion, of being able to notice your thoughts with an attitude of open curiosity and kind of pick the ones that are useful, that are helpful to you without being wrapped around the axle of them or entangled with them. It includes acceptance, which we mean by that is not tolerance or resignation, but the original etymological meaning of acceptance, which was to receive, is just to receive a gift. It's still in English in the form of here, will you accept this when you give somebody a gift? And to accept what is inside thoughts, feelings, memories, and bodily sensations that are of use to you. Doesn't mean accepting a situation, doesn't mean accepting your behavior. It means getting present with the gift that's offered inside your own capacity to feel, sense, and remember. It includes flexible attention to the now, of being able to come into the now within and without, and including finding in the now or thoughts about the past or thoughts about the future. That's okay. It's not that the future and past are irrelevant. We're not disappearing into the now. But we're coming into the now in a way that's flexible, fluid, and voluntary, so we can allocate attention to what's present inside and out that are of use to what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And we do that from a sense of perspective or point of view. That's the hardest of it. It's the one I started to do a geek thing on with the underlying RFT theory. It's almost that which shall not be named. There's 15 different names for it in the ACT world, and not because it's Voldemort, but because it's not thing-like. It doesn't have clear edges or spatial-temporal dimensions. It's the I here nowness of awareness. It's not awareness of something. I'm talking about pure awareness, just awareness. It's like here, the fromness of experience, which is deeply connected to what your mama saw when she looked in your eyes. It's really we are conscious. We as a human species are conscious. And you were brought into that kind of consciousness that can move around across time, place, and person, where you can imagine looking at yourself from the outside. You can imagine being older and looking at yourself now, or looking back at yourself when you're a kid. You can imagine what it's like to be in Bangladesh and facing the storm that you just read about. You can imagine what your great-grandchildren will face if we don't do something about global warming. You can move the I hear nowness of awareness across time, place, and person. And so it's this ineffable, transcendent quality of just pure awareness that is established, I think, in all the wisdom traditions. And we're learning ways to do it in quicker fashion for people who are on the faculty floor. We call it self as context because nobody understands what that means. Yeah. The perspective-taking self, you might say, the observer self, the psychological you, everything, nothing, no self, big mind, one mind. I mean, every freaking tradition out there that's onto this has caution about speaking about it because it's not it-like, but it's the fromness awareness. From there, we then move towards qualities of being and doing that you want to bring into the world with your life. Those we mean by values. Values are not goals. They're not anything you can obtain and finish. They're adverbs. They're qualities of being and doing. So they disappear when you stop doing them. And you can orient towards them. You can do them. Orienting towards them is a kind of doing them, of admitting that you care about something, that it's of importance to you. A quick and dirty way of thinking about values are, can you turn it into an adverb? Can you put an ly on it? And is that something that will be there constantly over time? You know, like lovingly it's not like I have love, now I'm finished, I can go out and hurt people. And it's not like that. It doesn't have a beginning and middle and end. It's just a direction, like going west. And then committed action are just this gradual process of building larger and larger patterns of behavior that are organized around values choices. So those are the 6: diffusion, acceptance, in the now, consciously, values-based, and created patterns of action. If you put those all together, the sentence that you read earlier, when you said, is this psychological flexibility? You'll see all 6 are in there. And that's the one thing that is the assemblage of the 6 things. When we try to study them, we find that the 6 can collapse into 3. Acceptance and diffusion are opening and variability processes. Flexible attention to the now and consciousness are fitting it into the current context and centering processes. Values and committed action are selection and retention processes. When you turn those 6 into 3, you can turn them into 1, just call it psychological flexibility.
I see. So this is all a model of psychological flexibility.
Yeah.
Those are the processes.
That are the one. That are really just another way to talk, I think, about how evolution works with a psychological being that can do what we do with human language. That's what we're trying to solve. That's where the major religions start. That's where psychotherapy goes. They're called mental disorders for a reason, which is we do not have the sense that a dog or a cat or a cockroach has. Sometimes we just get in our own way, and this mind, this Wizard of Oz voice inside our head will, if we're not careful, will take everything all the way to the point of suicide and the least functional things we know to do. And we're learning. We've only been doing it for, maybe 200,000 years. We're not yet good at it, but we're learning how to both have our cake and eat it too, to have this ability and not have it just have us.
I loved in your book how you talk about you don't have to fight the battle. Like you have this battle within your head and you're allowed to just like step off the field. I'll step off the field.
Just leave the field of battle.
Yeah. I love that. And actually I've been thinking about that a lot every time I get too much internal drama. I say, I think I'm just not going to play this game anymore.
Well, drama's that's a good read. If you ever sense that kind of pull to drama, that's the voice talk.
What about people that pull you towards their drama? What can you do in those situations?
Sure, it becomes social. We love. And the thing about the social one, we look at Trump, let's say, yeah, dude, in that very moment, as you do that, you're doing the very process that you're criticizing. So be careful, But yeah, we love the drama of being dramatic about other people's drama.
We do, but I'm saying some people legitimately try to pull us into their drama.
They absolutely. we respectfully decline the invitation.
Yeah, I would like to not play, please. So I have another question. How come you didn't come up with some cutesy acronym for the six core I tried to do it just now while you were talking ACB, SVC, and I couldn't come up with anything.
There are some that are out there, actually, that you can summarize them. But, I find it hard to remember some of those acronyms. But we've done it inside the ACT literature. Russ Harris, who's brilliant as a writer, a popularizer of ACT, has really done a great job. He's particularly good at it. But I don't know, they don't stick in my head, and you'd want acronyms to help things stick in your head. So
yeah, I do. I have a great appreciation for those processes. Well, thank you so much for describing them. I'm still trying. I'm sorry if I keep returning to this point. This is maybe the fourth time I've returned to the third or fourth time I've returned to this point. But the idea of cognitive distortions. I'm trying to understand what place you see them. I
didn't pick up the thing that you laid down there, and so the error is on my part. But look, two different kinds of things. I mean, cognitive distortions for sure. I mean, our thinking about things can be distorted and lead us in incorrect ways. And relational frame theory is a theory about how language works, and we've actually done research on how to teach people to think more logically, how to use these ideas to do logical syllogisms and so forth. After all, most of what your logic teacher taught you is how to do relational framing in a way that's coherent. But the problem is that most people have had a fair amount of training on that. It's like the old social skills literature where it really slowed down when they asked people, pretend you're Superman and show me your best social skills. And suddenly these people who we thought were socially unskilled would show us skills. And then, it almost killed the field. It's the same kind of thing. I think very often people kind of know. If not, okay, walk them through the logical errors. But here's the problem. When you really get into logical errors and you focus on the content of your thinking, you're very close to losing your balance and becoming wrapped around and entangled with your cognitive thinking. Now, when I say this to my CBT friends, and we're part of the CBT tradition writ large, we're part of this family of methods. I've been president of ABCT, etc. But the third wave is more cautious about dealing with the content of cognitive distortions. And it's because when you do, it's very, very close to, I shouldn't think this way, I should think that way. And then the next step is holy beans, I'm thinking this way, what's the matter with me? And then the next step is stop thinking that. Well, by the time you're there, you're into thought suppression. And what happens now, you're stuck on that thought. You're monitoring whether or not it's come back. And we're already thinking in ways that are goofy and weak and irrational. The last thing we want to do is focus on that more and more. Enough if it's real information that we need. Okay, get the information. If I had a heart attack, I will die. Well, let me show you the data on that. Turns out occasionally, did I say if I had a heart attack? If I had a panic attack, I will die. Excuse me. Well, it turns out if you have a severe panic attack, there is some probability. It's tiny, 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 tiny. But most people think it's like this big increase you're about as a panic disordered person in recovery. I can tell you from the inside out, it really feels like, your heart couldn't stand what you're experiencing from the inside. But, give them information. But if it's still sticky, what I want to do is help people change their relationship to that distorted thought. And now to focus on forms of thinking that, yes, are probably more rational, but also just more useful and productive. So if you ask somebody this, how has that thought worked for you? Is that a familiar thought? Yes. Have you had that thought before? Yes. Has it been transformational in terms of its help to you? No. What does your instinct tell you? Do you think, dealing with that even more is going to be helpful? No, not really. What if we focus over here? In other words, you can take just simple questions about the person's own experience with how thoughts work and which ones are helpful or not. And they will be able to sort it out and say, this one's more helpful than that one. Well, then the problem is not that they have that one, it's that they don't know how to focus their mental energies and attention towards this one. Well, I can teach you how to do that. Well, one thing is to find a way to diminish the focus and intention on the other one, not by criticizing it. If you criticize it, judge it, and analyze it, you're focusing on it. If I can give you a personal example, I have tinnitus. It's pretty loud. I hardly ever notice it. I went through a 3-year period as an adult, one too many punk rock concerts, but not too long ago, it was about 10 years ago, of more and more focus on it. And, oh my God, this is awful. And when does this noise stop? And and then the thought came into mind, I should just shoot myself. If I shoot myself, I won't hear this noise anymore. It's 24. Nobody could live with this. And then the guy go like, dude, that's a suicidal thought. Maybe you should apply your life's work to it. It took me 3 years before it even occurred to me once that I should take what I worked my whole life on,
Yeah.
apply it to this domain. I did it. In about 2 days, it was almost 100% gone. In a week, it was 100% gone. And for 10 years, it's been gone. And
Wow.
now, what's gone? The noise? No. Kinda. Yes, kinda no. It's now very loud in this moment. 5 minutes ago, it was 100% gone and had been gone, I would guess, for at least 2 weeks. Was the noise still there? Of course it was still there. Of course it was. My ears ring 24/7. But
I actually hear a ringing.
do you?
Yeah, but I think it's
Right out my
static.
ear.
Are you sure it's not just static
So
from your
loud, it's actually transmitting.
No, there's actually static coming from your computer. Are you sure that's not it?
Oh, I'm sorry for the bad audio.
No, it's good. Go.
Well, my point here is, with things like cognitive distortions, etc., reappraisal, great if it's cognitive flexibility. If it's out with the bad, in with the good, bad, because then you're going to have to keep checking like a bad Verizon commercial. Is it gone yet? Is it gone yet? Is it gone yet? And every time you look, the answer will be no, because you just looked. And it's the same thing with things like, this ringing in my ears. If, on the other hand, we can just focus on what brings meaning and purpose and vitality and growth to your life, that cleans up a lot of your cognitive errors. Will you still be able to think in a wacky way? Sure you can. Everyone can. We know how to do it. We have done it. But it won't get in our way as long as we're cognitively flexible and able to focus on what's workable in your cognition. So the reason why cognitive distortions are there but not a huge issue in the ACT work is it hasn't empirically been shown to be that much helpful. And oh, by the way, that's true in traditional CBT. True as well. It's very hard to show in meta-analyses that challenging cognitive distortions add to the outcome of traditional CBT, as you probably know.
So what is the aspect of CBT that shows its effectiveness then?
The behavioral aspects dominantly, very, very dominantly. I mean, if you look at component analyses, the late Neil Jacobson did 2 wonderful, expensive, multi-site component analyses of traditional CBT and found that adding the cognitive elements didn't lead to outcomes. And in fact, in one of his studies in severe depression compared to just plain behavioral activation, it diminished outcomes. So, and it's not just those 2 studies, even though that was supervised by Keith Dobson or Steve Holland, with people literally calling back to Tim Beck every night and getting guidance. This was the best of the best, and the data are what the data are. So I look at the meta-analyses, the component analyses, and the mediational analyses, what's functionally important. And I say, I'm just not all that interested in cognitive distortions a little bit, because it's kind of interesting that we do it, and sometimes we can correct it. It's not just me. The metacognitive therapy people say the same thing. The mindfulness-based cognitive therapy people say the same thing. So let's see. Focus on the processes. If you can really show me that it's all that helpful, I'll do it.
Well, thanks for elucidating that, because I really wasn't aware that the cognitive distortions approach wasn't in meta-analysis shown to be effective, because it forms a core part of the resiliency training here at Penn, for instance, the ABCD, model, become aware.
Yeah, but these are packages. And so what you need to do is the components and the mediators. And, the CBT package. And I have to give you the other part, which is inside Western culture, singing that song really gives us a good rationale for doing some of the other things we do, like, deliberately doing behavioral homework that challenges some of the distortions, things like that. So, and you need that. You need a rationale that people understand. In some ways, ACT and things like that is a little bit harder because we come at it from left field, and sometimes people have a little harder time. I guess now with the issue of mindfulness becoming so central, it's a lot easier. But back in the day, it was a little harder to sometimes explain to people why you want to take this approach. So there's different reasons why you still might want to do it. And I don't want to, bang the table. Let's see what the data show. But right now, I think you'd have a hard time really building it out as central and important.
Fascinating. Thank you for your perspective, because I wasn't fully aware of all that. Well, you got to just tell the audience, what is the mind train? Because I have found that thinking about my thoughts in that way have been so helpful to me and my own anxiety issues.
Well, the metaphor of the mind train, which is in Get Out of Your Mind into Your Life, is one of several physical metaphors that allow us to detect the moment when we get hooked and fused with thoughts versus that moment when we're stepping back and watching our thoughts. And basically all it is, there's a whole set of these exercises that have some kind of physical, perceptual structure for something that is repetitive and passing, and then asking the person to put their images, if they think in images, or words, and if they think in words, to put them on that object, and then to watch them go by, but with the instruction that if you lose it, if you disappear, if you're somewhere else, to stop, go back and see what just happened. And so you could do it with clouds in the sky, with cars on the freeway, leaves floating down on a stream, persons walking by with placards in a parade, or like being on a bridge and watching a train go underneath the bridge. What it adds that I think does add something to some of the things that are in Vipassana style meditation, things like that, is a very clear perceptual hook for something that happens in a few milliseconds when a thought catches you and hooks you, and it focuses on that transition. And if you do something like following the breath, let's say, you'll find that the puppy wanders away and you'll come back to the breath. But sometimes you miss the exact moment that you wandered away. And these exercises, these perceptual exercises, really focus in on that exact moment, because you can sense when you lost the image, the train is no longer going, you're on the train, in the train, you become the train. I mean, you catch it. And what we're asking people to do is back up a little bit and watch what was going on. And very often it's not a thought that you necessarily would have thought would be difficult. Like, here's one. Boy, I'm doing a good job doing this. Or here's another one. What is this for? Or here's another one. How long is this going to go on? Or is it, so these are a collection of thoughts that are about the process, right? Yeah. What your mind's doing is saying, time out. What I have to say now has nothing to do with you watching your mind. Now, I'm not sure why this matters. I'm not sure you're even doing it right. And oh, by the way, you like that. And just because the voice says time out, this is a different thing, you get tricked. Of course, you can do that in meditation too. Oh, I'm doing a great job meditating today. Well, your face just hit the floor, because, yes. Well, so we have this is part of the kind of trying to pull it at its joints, not of disrespect for the mindfulness traditions, but in an effort to add something new to those traditions. We've tried to come up with exercises that really dial you into these critical moments that the theory tells us are key, like the difference between a thought that you interact with that structures your world versus interacting with a thought that you can look at as a process of structuring of the world. It's like the difference between watching a hand write versus reading the story and disappearing into the story. And the mind train exercise is one of a whole body of exercises that we have out there to help people practice noticing that pivot point between fusion and diffusion that's inside contemplative practice and meditation.
Oh, it's so great. Yeah, I like the, like as opposed to being the freight, or being the coal on the train, and actually watching it go by. I really like that. You said something about mindfulness. You said your face just hit the floor. What did that mean?
No, all I meant by that is that, anybody who meditates knows that you are in the flow, but then your mind starts talking to you about it, and suddenly you're not. I mean, you're not following the breath. You're not present. You're, it's like riding a bicycle. You just fell off the bicycle and did a face plant in the asphalt.
Gotcha.
And, get back on with the bicycle, get your balance, start pedaling again. I was using that as kind of a metaphor for being in the flow of this continuous process of noticing and noticing. And actually, a bicycle is not a bad idea, because in contemplative practice, you're getting knocked off balance. It's not that you're always perfectly in balance. If you slowed down a picture of you riding a bike, you could show that, moment by moment, you're falling out of balance. But you adjust to it and you come back in balance, and you can keep pedaling and moving. Meditation's like that. Life can be like that.
Life is like that.
Teach people to be like that. And really, if you want a single metaphor for psychological flexibility, that wouldn't be bad.
Cool.
We get buffeted by emotions and thoughts. We get knocked off balance. If we can come into the present and find balance, that's that process of the centering processes of aware consciously in the moment. Well, then we can look ahead down the road. Where are we going? And start pedaling. Well, that's values and committed action. So, we're just riding a bicycle.
That's cool. We're just riding a bicycle.
We're going to have to write that out, Scott. I'll call it the Scott metaphor.
Oh.
The bicycle metaphor, psychological flexibility.
SBK, call it SBK. That's what my friends call me. I mean, look, if I'm not my thoughts, then who the heck am I? I mean, can you tell, like, is there a way of doing this ACT approach but still keeping a sense of a strong identity?
Yeah, well, that's a funny one because by identity we also mean, well, usually mean verbal identity. We mean the ones that we can say or give voice to. And it is true that in the ACT tradition we're pretty hostile to verbal identities.
Yeah. If I disidentify with all my thoughts, then what am I allowed to identify with, sir?
Yeah. Well, what if you did it more descriptively and in the situation? Like, when I'm in this situation, I do this, then I feel that. Well, that's a kind of thing. There's a kind of but the couple problems with the overall identity. Let's take something like, I'm smart and loving, right? If you really dig into it, you'll probably realize that the reason that you can say you're smart is that you're smarter than who?
If you're alone on a desert island, you can't really say you're that smart.
You can't say smart. So think about what this means. It isn't just I'm smart. I'm smarter than you and you and you. And then you wonder why you feel alone? Really? You wonder? I mean, dude, right inside the, swallowing that pill of identity is aloneness and alienation. It's objectification and dehumanization. It's comparison. I'm better than you, or I'm worse than you. It doesn't matter. You could say, I'm a borderline person. And you've had clients, who will give you a challenge, and you can almost hear them whispering, you've never seen anyone so disturbed as me. Very prideful, about how great and grand their suffering is, when in fact it's as common as dirt. You talk to anybody and you're good. So, and not that I don't mean to, I know how that could sound. Obviously some people have had horrific histories, and I don't want to.
I do know what you mean. Yeah.
But when you climb inside the clown suit of the story and pridefully hold on to it, that's a different thing. So, what would happen if we kind of held all that a little lighter? Like, let's take something like smart and loving. When I do things like this in situations like this, that's smart. That's cool. That's great. That orients you towards something that's important. When I'm in these kinds of situations, like, for example, when I'm tired and my wife wants a back scratch, doing that is loving. Okay, that's great. But why do we need the I'm part? Couldn't you say something more like, I'm committed to these kind of patterns. I care about that, without the clown suit of I'm that will have the comparison part, number one. Number two, here's another one. I ask people to write down the things that they identify with, and then I say, take all the ones you really like. Now look at them. Now I just have a few questions. All the time, everywhere, with everyone, question mark. And I usually pause and then say, liar. So, and you look at them, like, I'm loving all the time with everybody. No, it's not true, dude. You know it. You've betrayed people. You've lied to people. You've let them down. Even people who are close to you, you've let them down. There are times, right? And so when you climb inside the identity, now your own experience is your enemy. What if you see the places where you're just telling a story? So you got comparison and you got self-deception. I'm starting to make a list here. This is a little dangerous. Here's an identity part that's inside the ACT work. This more specific one of what you care about and what you're trying to build, that's context specific. But then the only other one that's really safe is I'm. That's it. I'm. I mean, being is just being, okay? I mean, if you took all of the kind of attributes and instead you got to consciousness itself and your connection with others, you're part of a human community. Is just being enough?
Well, I think it is. My answer is yes, but personality psychologists have revolved their entire career around administering personality surveys and questionnaires, which have the explicit prompt, I am ... on a scale of 1 to 5.
Yeah.
And I mean, I am a personality psychologist in part, so I see value in classifying these patterns. But you said something that was really brilliant. I think you don't need to commit to the patterns. Now, you just threw away that comment, but I just want you to know that's going to be something I'm going to use many years in my career. It's just a very, very good reconciliation of personality psychology with ACT therapy, because you can notice mindfully your patterns. That's all personality is. It doesn't mean you're
Sure.
always this way. It's tendencies. Tendencies. Distributions like a bell curve during the course of your day, you tend to be more 4 or 5 on a dimension versus someone else. That's all it means. But it doesn't mean you don't have 1s and 2s and 3s at every level. So I
Yeah,
love
and
that.
it's context bound. It can evolve over time. There are some really clear central tendency, and some of these are temperamentally hop out of the womb with some of these features. But you don't have to go very far with the etymology of personality before you realize there's a toxic little core there. And persona was the Latin word for a mask or a false face that actors put on, the clay masks in Roman theater. So, it's right in there. Our persona is also, once we grab it and hold on to it, and you say, I'm fill in the blank, now you got a mask. Now you're wearing the mask. Now you've climbed into the clown suit. And is that really in your interests? Would it be better just to come into the respectful ambiguity of I don't know and let's see, the presence of awareness that affords connection with others, and in your behavior play out these tendencies that are of importance to you? Like, I really do want to be careful in my work because of what it's able to do for others. And so you're sitting here, let's say, doing an interview with a psychologist, and you've prepped enough that you can ask good questions and somebody can benefit from later on. And you know that hundreds of thousands of people may listen to it and things might happen in their lives as a result and stuff. Do you need the mask to do that? Or could that just be something that's of importance regularly for you that you do with verve and regularity and care and not be attached to it? But that's the diffusion piece. Now, we've done this in areas. I'm going to mention one that's probably going to get us in trouble. But we published something on helping people coming out and dealing with ambiguity about their sexual orientation. Jamie Adavaya, a member of my lab, an out gay member of my lab, did some work on this. And part of what he got into, and I know you read it, look at the protocol and look at his tapes, because it's actually linked on the article. You can actually see the tapes of him working. He actually tries to soften the identity part. Because if you go too far down to, I'm a gay man who, there's another clown suit there. There's another clown suit there. And I understand it. I get it. But maybe we don't need quite so much of it.
A lot of introverts are claiming that as an important identity. Giftedness is another big one. A lot of adults who've been identified as gifted as children, it's a very important part of their identity, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you can make a whole list of identities that are, personality dimensions where people have internalized it. And you're saying...
Isn't it getting longer and longer and longer, and there's more and more effort to train it? And I'm wondering, what are we doing? Really, what are we doing there? I get that there's heart to it, and people are trying, especially if these are areas of special needs and have been stigmatized. I get that. And of course, I'm with you. I'm talking about inside white privilege, etc. Although also within my family, I have an African-American daughter. I can list how many great aunts and uncles died in ovens. I was married to 2 Hispanic wives, and I understand.
Wait, you're married to 2 wives right now?
No, but I've had 2 Hispanics of the 3 that I've had. But, I'm not saying that by way of saying that my own sense of privilege is erased by that. That's not true.
Yeah.
I'm just saying I've been interested in watching how stigma and self-stigma works. And part of what we've tried to do in the ACT work, because we've done about 15 trials of stigma, prejudice, etc., is to increase the connection with values, increase the kind of presence and emotional openness and working together in community, and soften a little bit in these areas of identity where they're not fostering what we really want. There's pieces of it that we do want, like what we were just talking about.
Right. Because it could be the case that some of those identities are linked to your values.
Yes.
So then that's fine. Yeah.
Grab onto that part and make those values really relevant in the world.
So what I will end here with just a summation of all this seems to be that you can choose to live a vital life.
Exactly right. If you learn how to sort of rein in the excesses of the voice within, the dictator within, that Wizard of Oz voice, so that choice can now be part of your life. Selecting among alternatives. I'm a behaviorist. I'm not talking about something that's airy-fairy and beyond what we can learn how to do. You can choose to live a vital, committed human life. And, even inside your pain, that doesn't have to go away before you get the privilege of being human. you got that as a birthright.
Well, let's just end right there. Thank you so much, Stephen, for being on the podcast and for your quite revolutionary and impactful work.
Thank you. I enjoyed it a lot. And you're a lot of fun, SBK. Yeah.
Thanks. I think we both have a sort of childlike curiosity spirit at the heart. So it was a nice match.
It was fun play.
Thank you so much for listening to the Psychology Podcast with Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman. I hope you found this episode just as thought-provoking as I did. If something you heard today stimulated you in some way, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com. That's thepsychologypodcast.com.